to move forward where we can see there's lots of space. So I'm Lisa Grossman. I'm a reporter for New Scientist magazine, and our guest is Bormanis. Andre is an American television producer, screenwriter, and author of the book Star Trek Science Logs. Bormanis is most notable for his involvement in the long-running Star Trek franchise and was a science consultant on Star Trek The Next Generation, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Voyager, and Star Trek Enterprise. He also wrote several episodes of the Voyager and Enterprise series, as well as acting as science technical advisor on The Next Generation films. He was also a writer and producer for the CBS science fiction drama Threshold, the CBS drama series 11th Hour, the ABC Studios production Legend of the Seeker, and the upcoming Britney Spears production Tron Uprising. So you had a science background also. You were interested in science earlier, and you were also interested in Star Trek. So which came first, Andre the scientist or Andre the Trekkie?
You know, that's hard to say. I think they kind of, it's like a chicken and egg question. They co-evolved.
Right.
I loved space. As a kid, I would look up at the stars, and by the time I was 7 or 8 years old, I started learning the constellations. This was in the 1960s, and the space program was getting into high gear, getting ready to put a man on the moon, and so it was an exciting time to be a kid interested in space. And Star Trek was one of the few TV shows out there that spoke to that interest. So it not only was something that I was attracted to by my own temperament, but that certainly encouraged and inspired my interest in real science and real astronomy, real space science.
How did you get involved in being a science advisor on Star Trek franchise?
It's an interesting story. I studied physics and astronomy in college, did some graduate work in astrophysics before I got sort of shuffled off into the microcomputer world, which was burgeoning in the early 1980s. A lot more jobs for computer people than there were for astronomers back then. And I also had a very strong interest in writing, even as an undergraduate. I had an English minor simply because I liked to take a literature class every semester to break up all the math and physics. Loved to read. I've been a reader since a very young age. And I also admired people like Carl Sagan, who were scientists who were also terrific writers. And I thought, you know, I really want to try my hand at writing. I did a lot of technical writing. I took some creative writing classes and was encouraged by my teachers. And in the early 1990s, I was offered a NASA fellowship to go spend 2 years at a place called the Space Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. And I spent 2 years studying policy for the U.S. space program, which was fascinating and great fun and wonderful to live in the Washington area. And it was while I was doing that I had tried to get myself a meeting to go pitch stories to Star Trek The Next Generation. That was the series that was on the air at the time, and I knew that they sometimes took submissions from outside writers. I had a couple of friends who lived here in Los Angeles and were working as television writers. And they said, well, you know, if you go to the Writers Guild, they'll give you a list of agents who are looking for first-time writers. So I just knocked on doors and submitted my work and found an agent finally who was interested in representing me. She was trying to get me a meeting to go pitch stories to Star Trek when she found out that they needed a new science consultant. I didn't even know that they had one. I just didn't realize. And she said, oh, they're looking for somebody who has a science background, but who also knows the show, knows how to read a script. She said, oh, I think you'd be perfect. And the guy who had been doing it was one of her clients, and he'd been promoted onto the writing staff. And that created the opening for me. So long story short, I came out to Hollywood, I met everybody, and they liked me, and they interviewed me, and they hired me. And they needed me to start literally to the week that my NASA fellowship ended at George Washington University in D.C. So in May of 1993, I moved from D.C. to Los Angeles to become the science consultant for Star Trek.
Nice.
Yeah.
What does a science consultant do?
Well, mostly what I did was I helped the writers with science ideas in their stories and also technical language in the dialogue that they were writing. So, for example, that we did an episode of the Deep Space Nine series that involved a comet in a prominent role. And the two guys who wrote that episode called me and said, hey, you know, we're doing this episode, it's got a comet. Pretty much know what a comet is, but how big is a comet, and what are they actually made of, and when does the tail form, and what is that, you know, how does that work? And So we spent about an hour on the phone just talking about comets and, gave them a lot of background information. And then I wrote up some notes for them that they could have handy when they wrote the script. And then when I finally got the script, I just went through it and, made any adjustments that I felt were necessary to the description or the language that the science characters were using to talk about this comet. So that was pretty much, typical of the process.
So that's pretty straightforward and grounded in science that we understand
Yes.
now. So, but a lot of Star Trek is not. So how do you balance
Indeed.
that?
That was tough, That was the kind of thing where that was probably the steepest part of the learning curve for me in doing that job is, occasionally I would be presented with a story point that was couched in scientific terminology but was clearly not real science. And then my task was, well, how can I deal with this? I want it to be as true to the science that we understand today as it can be, but I understand that this is a show that takes place hundreds of years in the future. We're free to bend the rules. It's fiction. It's, we're going to learn a lot of things in the next few hundred years that we don't know today, and we'll find out some of the things we think we know today are probably wrong. One example that comes to mind is an episode of Deep Space Nine, again, where our crew beams down to a planet and discovers that none of their devices work. The communicators and phasers and tricorders, they're all on the fritz. What could be doing this? Well, they assume initially it must be some kind of a natural phenomenon associated with the planet. So I thought, oh, okay, well, electronic devices, if you expose them to an intense magnetic field or a rapidly fluctuating electromagnetic field, it can fritz out, the current within those devices, short it out. And so maybe that's the reason. So I put into the dialogue, and poor Colm Meaney, who played Chief O'Brien, was the person who was given the task of trying to explain this phenomenon. Well, there may be a rapidly fluctuating electromagnetic field source somewhere in the vicinity, blah, 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 blah. Well, the poor guy has to say this like 15 times in the script, and I didn't really think about that. And I remember getting my first set of notes back from Michael Piller, who was the executive producer of the show at that time, and he'd scribbled NGE next to my suggestion, NGE. So I called Jerry Taylor, who was another producer, and she was basically the person who hired me, and great, great woman, and I always felt very comfortable with Jerry. And I said, Jerry, I got my notes back from Michael, and he scribbled NGE. What does that mean? Oh, she said, not good enough. So mortified, I went back to my computer and tried to think. And then it started to dawn on me that, oh, this poor guy, he's got to say this so many times. It's got to be something short and sweet. I think I can go with something fictional because, as it turns out, this was going to be an artificial alien technology that was causing their instruments to go, kaflooey. So it didn't have to be really explained in terms of a natural phenomenon. So I kind of split the difference. And in the original Star Trek, there was an episode called The Ultimate Computer where they talk about the duotronic circuitry that runs the Starship Enterprise. And this scientist had created something called a multitronic computer that was going to be better than duotronics. And they did this because they thought the term electronics might sound too primitive for the Star Trek universe. So I thought, oh, I remember that, duotronics. What if I come up with a duonetic field, like the magnetic equivalent of duotronics? I get to invent a little term for the Star Trek universe. It's consistent with stuff that had been done on the previous incarnations of Star Trek. And it was short and sweet. And I submitted that, and Michael said, oh, perfect, duonetic field. And that's something that an actor can remember and say, however many different times in the script and not trip over his own tongue trying to get out, all of this verbiage. And that was another, aspect of being the science consultant is I had to remember and remind myself pretty regularly that these are actors who are speaking these lines who have no science background and have to figure out clever ways to memorize these terms that even though they might mean something to a physicist, mean nothing to them.
It might as well be doing that.
It might as well be that. And then on top of that, they not only just have to remember their lines, they've got to be, they're typically in a scene with other actors. And they've got to remember, where do I stand? When do I move? Where's my mark? When is the camera going to change? And what is this character thinking? What are they thinking? What am I thinking? What's my motivation? What's my attitude? All of this other stuff going on. You don't want to saddle them with this technobabble, as we lovingly called it, that doesn't mean anything to them in a scene that doesn't really require it. And one of the actresses, Terry Farrell, who played the scientist character Dax on Deep Space Nine, I assume that this is for consumption of kids as well as adults, so I will paraphrase what she told me the first time I met her. I met Terry at the wrap party for the first season I worked at Deep Space Nine, a little party at the end of the season where you celebrate being done and going on vacation. And this was at a little hotel bar kind of area. And I see Terry, and I'd never met her. I hadn't met her at that point, and kind of sheepishly walk up to her, and she's very tall. She's like 6 feet tall, and very lovely, elegant-looking woman. And she was just standing by herself, so I thought I'd go introduce myself. I said, "Oh, Terry, hi. Hi, how are you?" And I said, "Oh, good. I'm Andre Bormanis. I'm the science consultant on the show." And she gets this face when I say that, this like grim expression. She literally grabbed me by the lapels, lifted me off my feet, and said, "You, da-da-da, da-da-da." And then she laughed, and she said, "Oh, I'm just messing with you." She said, and then she's the one who told me that, if I'm sitting there in a scene by myself and I'm talking to the computer, put in all the techno-babble you want. I'm happy to, I can learn it. I'm good at memorizing. I will be happy to say whatever you want me to say. But she said, if I'm in a scene with 2 other actors, and the scene is really about some character-related, emotional, whatever kind of issue, and I have to try to say, well, according to our last sensor scan of the blah, 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 she said, that's tough, because then I've got so many other things going on in my mind to make that scene work that I really can't handle a lot of the tech. And so that I thought was not only a valid point, but it was like really helpful to me to learn that and to hear what's going on from the actor's perspective, because ultimately, this is a show that is about characters and portrayed by people who are, very talented actors, and you have to respect their craft and what they bring to it as much as they respect, how me and the people that I called upon, who had other levels of expertise in different areas, would try to bring to the, the authenticity of the science.
So do you feel like it's important to have real science in a science fiction show? And do you think what effect do you think that has on the audience?
Yeah, I think it is. If you're going to call it science fiction as opposed to fantasy, I think that it's very important to make it credible. I very much enjoy Game of Thrones, which is a series on HBO, and it's clearly fantasy, and dragons are born out of eggs, a woman walks through fire. They don't need to explain how that happens. It's magic. They need to explain the rules. They need to basically tell you how their fantasy universe works so that, you don't feel like stuff is just coming out of left field all the time. But they don't have to explain it in terms of science. On Star Trek, when Gene Roddenberry created the original series, he very much wanted it to be a show for adults. He didn't want it to be Buck Rogers. He didn't want it to be kind of a kid's show, Captain Video. And he knew that in order to make this show accessible and enjoyable to adults, that the setting had to be credible. If you do a show that's set in a bar in Boston, pretty much everybody's been in a bar at one time or another in their life. And everybody knows what a bar is. And so you go into Cheers and you see Sam Malone and the waitresses, and everybody knows that world, and it's a comfortable world. Gene had to try to create a believable setting for his show that took place hundreds of years in the future, and the setting is a spaceship. And the bridge of the Enterprise is, that for Star Trek is Archie Bunker's living room or the Cheers bar. Well, most people don't have any experience of what being on a spaceship might be like. So Gene was very diligent about going to JPL, talking to the engineers and scientists there in the mid-'60s when he was developing this show. Had them come over to the house. What are you working on? And, oh, here's my starship. What do you think? What about, do we want to see some, traditional rocketry here? You'll never do interstellar travel with chemical engines. No, you don't want to show flames being, spit out the back of your engines. So all of these kinds of considerations went into achieving what writers call the willing suspension of disbelief. For that hour that you're watching Star Trek, you want the audience to forget that they're watching a TV show, to forget that we don't have real starships, and everything else that might get in the way of them enjoying the story that you're trying to tell. You know, in a show like Cheers, you don't have to worry too much about the bar being believable. On a show like Star Trek, you got to make sure the spaceship is believable. And clearly, it's going to have to be built upon technologies that don't exist today, that are, you know, highly speculative, like warp drive and transporters and things of that nature. But if you describe those in ways that are logically consistent, that are extensions of present-day technology, that recognize that traveling at extraordinary speeds is going to require things like inertial dampers, and that beaming somebody down to a planet, you know, you may need to figure out a way around Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, so better build in that Heisenberg compensator. Again, we have no idea how one would do such a thing, but we know that these are issues, and by addressing them in ways, you know, that are sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle, it just helps sell the believability of the show.
I want to open up to questions from the audience. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask Andre?
It was on Voyager that we got in that debate in the household where my wife and kid are from Jamie in science fiction. And I guess you were involved in Voyager.
Yes.
There was one moment where they had an element with an atomic number of up in the 300s.
Yes.
And another one where the whole episode of the ship was inside the event horizon of the
Yes.
black hole. And I had the impression that the science consultant must have been bound and gagged in a closet. So I wondered what it was like being bound and gagged in a closet while they were filming it.
I wasn't in a closet. I was to some extent bound and gagged. But again, it's, you know, I always tried to pull them back as much as I could pull them back without stepping on the story. Because ultimately, I was the consultant. The executive producer, Rick Berman at that time, was the one who decided which stories get approved and how we're going to do those stories. And if there was something in an episode that I thought, you know, that's really out of bounds, I couldn't just call Rick or write a note saying, you know, this doesn't work. I had to come up with an alternative that worked within the context of their story. And if I couldn't do that, I had to try to get as close as I could to that kind of alternative. So, you know, with the example of the, you know, the element that has a, you know, an atomic number of 300 or something, well, probably such things don't exist. But there is speculation that maybe farther along in the periodic table, in the 150, 175, maybe even higher atomic numbers, there are so-called islands of stability. Now, nobody has ever seen an element like that, but there is some speculation and reason to believe, in terms of, you know, nuclear theory, that such things might exist. So, you know, I could suggest a different number, and they may or may not accept that number, but at least there was some basis for that. Being inside the event horizon of a black hole, you know, yeah, that's the way that story, as I recall, portrayed that situation was highly questionable. But on the other hand, Voyager is a starship that has a warp drive. So being inside of the event horizon of a black hole is not necessarily the end of the world if you've got warp drive. That's fictional, but that is part of the setting of the show. You know, if you're going to watch Star Trek and enjoy it, you're going to have to believe that starships can travel faster than the speed of light. As unlikely, as implausible as that might be, that's the premise of the show. The transporters are, again, I think that that's the one technology that I would say without any compunction or qualification will never exist. Even if somebody figured out teleportation in some fashion, it's not going to work like it does in Star Trek, and I have trouble believing it would ever be a practical form of transportation. It was done purely for the reason of being able to get your characters from this big spaceship in orbit down to an interesting planet in a very short time, because you've only got 45 minutes to tell your story on TV. And if you have to launch a shuttlecraft every time and do all of this other jazz to get your crew down to the planet, it's not going to be as interesting to the audience, at least in terms of the stories that Gene Roddenberry wanted to tell. So in that sense, yes, there were places where I was bound and gagged. But I think that those were fewer and farther between than the places where they sought my input and wanted to make it as close to our current understanding of science as possible. But I will say that, you know, I remember we did an episode of Voyager where Janeway, for whatever reason, was just saying, you know, the universe began X many billion years ago, right? And I knew the consensus number was in the 15 to 18 billion range or whatever at that time, right? Billions of years old. And I called my friend Laura Danley, who's a PhD astronomer, a good friend of mine, who is the curator at Griffith Observatory, and I said, Laura, so we got this line, you know, where Janeway is casually mentioning the age of the universe. What's the consensus number? And she said, I think right now they're settling into something around 13.7 billion, but you know what? You ought to have her say 48 billion years just to tweak all the astronomers in the audience. And I thought, well, that's very funny. And she was half serious because she said, you know what? That number has changed so much. And yes, I think we have a lot of reason to believe that we're closing in on a good value today, but who's to say that people are going to believe that 400 years from now? We may find that, you know, 400 years in the future, there's a very different theory for the origin of the universe. Unlikely, but, you know, given that just a few years ago they discovered that the expansion of the universe actually began to accelerate 6 or 7 billion years ago. Personally, I think all bets are off in terms of what's the age of the universe. I don't know. I mean, I'm waiting until they figure out that dark energy thing first before we can, you know, sort of accept that 13.7 billion number. So when you bring up something like, well, you know, an element with an atomic number of 300, yeah, I think that's kind of crazy too. But I have to admit there is a slight chance that I could be wrong, you know?
Any other questions?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you know of any shows in the pipeline that are going to be as interesting as Star Trek, as closely tied to science as Star Trek?
Oh gosh, I wish. There are some new shows that are coming on this fall that have supernatural elements, but they're not really science fiction. I'm trying to think if there is any science fiction per se that is in the pipeline. I think that there might be something in development at the SciFi Channel. They are looking for another space opera kind of a show. You know, they go back and forth on whether they want to do another Battlestar Galactica type show, and now supposedly the pendulum has swung back in the direction of them wanting to do that. But I don't know if they have anything really in active development. I am trying to get a show. I wrote a pilot earlier this year that is actually based on a present-day astronomer who was a Jesuit brother. If you know that the Vatican runs an observatory, they have a big telescope on Mount Graham in southern Arizona, and I always thought that was, you know, I'd been familiar with the Vatican astronomy program a little bit and met a couple of the Jesuit astronomers years ago, and I always thought that that's an interesting character. It could be an interesting basis for a TV show about science and how does a person of faith live in a world where, you know, we have this kind of reductionist, materialist mentality. And I would certainly want to make that a show grounded in science. So, but yeah, in terms of any kind of new space type stuff, not aware of anything right at the moment in the pipeline.
Sounds great. I would watch that.
Thank you. Good. I'm going to tell them. I'm going to tell Sonny that.
Have you met Guy Consolmagno?
I met him very briefly at a conference on the Galilean satellites like 15 years ago. And I've read his book. Yeah, he's a very nice guy. Struck me as a very nice guy, and I liked his book quite a bit.
He's one of the few research astronomers who's an observer.
Yes.
And he's a Jesuit.
Yeah. And a very committed Jesuit. I mean, people don't go into that, you know, brotherhood and halfway. So, yeah.
So what do you think it was about Star Trek that made it so resonant and so, you know, powerful and inspiring for such a long time?
Yeah.
For so many people?
That's, you know, that's a huge question, and there have been many, many answers to that question over the years. I think a lot of it was the chemistry of that cast. It was this quirky family of people who didn't always get along, at least in the original series, and they had a spaceship that they could go anywhere with. And I think that for me, the appeal of Star Trek was mostly about that the excitement and the freedom to explore, and the idea that, the world doesn't have to be a bad place. The world can become a very good place, and in fact, we think that the world will become a very good place. And Star Trek is one of the few TV shows, movie franchises, science fiction literature, serials that really spoke to a very positive view of the human future. Most science fiction of the last 30, 40 years has been dystopian. Not necessarily because science fiction writers have a gloomy view of humanity. Ray Bradbury used to say, I'm not trying to predict the future, I'm trying to prevent it. He didn't think that Fahrenheit 451 would necessarily happen. He wanted to make sure that people understood that this shouldn't happen for lots of reasons. But Star Trek really just sort of said, you know what, let's have a positive role model here too, Let's do something that sort of elevates the human spirit and makes people feel good about what we're capable of as human beings. And I think that is probably a big part of its popularity.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Is there anything else? Okay.
Yes.
Andre, I was wondering if there were any ideas that you had that you managed to push into scripts. You were talking about reviewing scripts.
Yes.
But did you manage to push many ideas of your own into something?
Oh, sure. And I ended up writing or co-writing about 20 episodes of Star Trek. I co-wrote a half a dozen Voyagers and then about 12 or 13 Enterprise episodes. So, my stories, I mostly write about the things that I fear, which are dying and losing my mind, not necessarily in that order, or probably the top two. And a lot of my stories revolve around those kinds of themes. But whenever I had the opportunity to bring in a science idea, I did. And for example, there was an episode of Star Trek Voyager that was written by a woman named Lisa Klink, who was one of our writers, and she was doing a story where some aliens were actually conducting an experiment on the crew of Voyager, kind of treating us like lab rats. And while they're doing that, we're not aware that they're doing it, while they're doing that, we're doing a scientific investigation of a spatial phenomenon. And Lisa called me and said, I'm doing this story and I need a really cool space phenomenon. What have we not seen? What have we not done on the show that's kind of new and breaking news in the science world that could be fun on this, for this episode? And I said, I've been reading recently about research into binary pulsars, basically neutron stars that are orbiting each other. And because of the intense gravitational attraction between very dense objects like neutron stars, they would shed energy as they orbit each other through gravitational waves. And Captain Janeway, as some of you may know, was an astrophysicist as well as a starship captain. And I said she would be very interested in watching this, especially if they were getting closer and closer to merging and potentially forming a black hole. So I got binary pulsars as a sort of central character in that episode. And rather than trying to do the painstaking work of figuring out the details of the orbital mechanics, I cleverly called a scientist at Caltech named Sri Kulkarni and asked him if he would mind doing a few little back-of-the-envelope type calculations for us to describe this binary pulsar system, what it might look like, how long it would take for the two objects to spiral into each other, and so forth. So there were things like that I brought into the show that I'm happy that we exposed those ideas to a larger audience. But a lot of the writers came up with stuff too. Ken Biller, who is one of our writers on Voyager, read an article in the New York Times magazine about symbiogenesis, and he came up with a story that used symbiogenesis as its starting point. And a really fascinating, compelling story that was, a science fictional leap, a what if, symbiogenesis, this idea that some of the cells in our body actually are hybrids, that the mitochondria in many of our cells might have been, billions of years ago, foreign organisms that the progenitor cells ingested but didn't digest, and they took up this symbiotic relationship. So we kind of have a different species living inside of us, basically. And Ken extrapolated that into a story where two of our crew members merged through a weird symbiogenesis process. And then we have to try to figure out how to deconstruct them. But that means killing this new life form who doesn't want to die. And that was cool, So there were a lot of, efforts on both sides to try to really bring interesting science into these stories. And occasionally we would go off a little willy-nilly into stories that were more horror or more highly speculative, which I always felt was, maybe that's a fun deviation once in a while, but I was never particularly a fan of those episodes. I thought Star Trek worked best when there was an interesting science idea at the core of an interesting moral dilemma or a social issue. That to me was kind of like the template for the ideal Star Trek episode.
Okay, do we have time for any more? Is that okay? We're going
No?
to leave it there.
Oh.
All right. Well,
I'll be happy
Be
to talk to
available
anybody
later?
afterwards. So.
all right, great. Well, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.